Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In South Vietnam, the political crisis deepens. In Alabama, a newsman is attacked. In Washington, President Kennedy talks 1964. The nuclear test ban treaty is signed, the Valachi Hearings are criticized, and the Dodgers are set for a big payday. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Just as all things in nature thirst for water, so does the skin thirst for moisture. To safeguard this moisture, use Princess Dial, the complexion soap with moisturizing cream right in it. Princess Dial works to replenish the delicate oils that hold in moisture, hold out dryness. Princess Dial with moisturizing cream for the woman who has been afraid to use soap on her face.
On Friday, President Kennedy, quote-unquote, recalled for consultations John Richardson, head of CIA operations in South Vietnam. The move was apparently an attempt to resolve a dispute between Mr. Richardson and Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge. Saigon sources confirmed reports that Ambassador Lodge had requested that Mr. Richardson be replaced. This request was conveyed to President Kennedy by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who recently visited South Vietnam with General Maxwell Taylor. The dispute between Mr. Richardson and Ambassador Lodge was said to be part of a larger disagreement among various officials in Washington and South Vietnam. Two factions have formed, each with different views concerning what should be done about South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem's repressive measures against the Buddhists. One faction argues that nothing should be done, as any move against President Diem would undermine the war against the communists. This is said to have been Mr. Richardson's position. Others believe the Diem regime must be forced to enact political reforms. Mr. Lodge is said to hold this view. At today's press conference, President Kennedy was asked about CIA activities in South Vietnam, including recent reports that the agency had conducted operations independent of other elements of the U.S. government in that country.
I must say I think the reports are wholly untrue. The fact of the matter is that Mr. McCone sits in the National Security Council. I imagine I see him at least 3 or 4 times a week. We work very closely together in the National Security Council in the last 2 months, attempting to meet the problems we faced in South Vietnam. I can find nothing, and I've looked through the record very carefully over the last 9 months, and I could go back further to indicate that the CIA has done anything but support policy. It does not create policy. It attempts to execute it in those areas where it has competence and responsibility. I know that the transfer of Mr. John Richardson, who's a very dedicated public servant, has led to surmises, but I can just assure you flatly that the CIA has not carried out independent activities, but has operated under close control of the Director of Central Intelligence, operating with the cooperation of the National Security Council and under my instructions. So while the CIA may have made mistakes, as we all do on different occasions, and has had many successes, which may go unheralded, in my opinion in this case, it's unfair to charge them as they have been charged. I think they've done a good job.
The president was asked about a recent proposal by Democratic Senator Ernest Gruening of Alaska that a congressional committee be set up as a watchdog over the CIA.
I think the present committee, as one in both the House and Senate, which maintains very close liaison with the CIA, is best considering the sensitive nature of the Central Intelligence Agency's work. As you know, there is a congressional committee in the House, one in the Senate, composed of members of the Appropriations Committee and the Armed Services Committee. They meet frequently with Mr. McCone. He also testifies before the Foreign Relations Committee of the House and Senate and the General Armed Services Committee, and I think the Congress has, through that organization, the means of keeping a liaison with them. In addition, I have an advisory council, which was headed by Dr. Killian formerly. Now Mr. Clark Clifford includes Jimmy Doolittle and others, Robert Murphy, who also serve as an advisory committee to me on the work of the intelligence community. I'm well satisfied with the present arrangement.
Finally, the president was asked about a recent remark by Allen Dulles, former head of the CIA, to the effect that disputes between the agency and other branches of the U.S. government in Vietnam had arisen because of, quote, a lack of a clear-cut operational policy in Washington, unquote. Mr. Dulles, who was forced to resign after the Bay of Pigs debacle in 1961, also said there should be less backbiting between U.S. agency officials.
I'd agree with the last part of it, that the agencies, as we all know, we're faced with a very difficult problem in South Vietnam, which you're all familiar with, both on the military and the political side. Men have different views about what actions we should take, and they talk to members of the press, to all of you, in Saigon, here in Washington. But I must say that as of today, and I think this is particularly true since General Taylor and Secretary McNamara came back, I know of no disagreement between the State Department at the top, CIA at the top, Defense at the top, White House, and Ambassador Lodge on what our basic policies will be and what steps we will take to implement it. Now, if down below there's disagreement, I think in part it will be because they're not wholly informed of what actions we're taking. Some of them are necessarily confidential, but I think our policy, though we can't say what effect it's going to have, I think we are in agreement of about what we ought to do. I would think that Saigon and personnel in the various agencies should support that policy because that's the policy we're going to carry out for a while.
On Saturday, the crisis in South Vietnam took a turn for the worse when another Buddhist monk burned himself to death in Saigon that morning. A U.S. Embassy spokesman said Ambassador Lodge was shocked by the suicide, was deeply concerned about its political implications, and had called an immediate conference of U.S. staff members. 3 American newsmen who witnessed the death, John Sharkey and Grant Wolfkill of NBC and David Halberstam of the New York Times, were beaten by plainclothes police as they left the scene. Mr. Sharkey, who sustained a head wound, had stitches taken at the American hospital in Saigon and remained there under observation. Mr. Wolfkill was clubbed and kicked, but was able to leave the hospital after treatment. Mr. Halberstam was bruised and battered, but less seriously hurt than the NBC men. The following day, Ambassador Lodge formally protested the assault to the South Vietnamese government, quote, in the most serious terms, unquote. The U.S. is also exploring what legal steps might be taken to follow up the ambassador's protest. It was the second major police attack on Western newsmen since the Buddhist protests began in May. In Selma, Alabama Monday, state troopers and local police roughed up 2 Negroes and a news photographer during a mass voter registration attempt at the Dallas County Courthouse. The 2 Negroes, both members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had tried to take sandwiches to some 200 Negroes who had stood in line all day without food or drink, waiting to register. Police officers grabbed the Negroes and threw them into a bus to be taken off to jail. Before their departure, a white man in plain clothes boarded the bus and threatened the Negroes' lives. First, the man asked, quote, "Where are you Negroes from?" unquote, using a racial epithet instead of the word Negroes. When one answered that he was from Illinois, the man said, quote, "You better get back there. If I see you on the street at night, I'm going to kill you," unquote. Wendell Hoffman, a CBS photographer covering the scene, was shoved into the street by sheriff's deputies and struck with a nightstick. One officer tried to strike at Mr. Hoffman's groin, but the photographer managed to ward off the blow with his camera. FBI agents and Justice Department employees in Alabama reported these incidents to Washington. At today's press conference, President Kennedy confirmed the widespread impression that he expected Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater to oppose him in next year's presidential election.
Is that your expectation?
I think he can do it. I think it's possible for him to do it. But he's got a long road to go, as recalling the situation in September 1959, October 1959. I think Senator Goldwater has a trying 7 or 8 months, which will test his endurance and his perseverance and his agility.
One reporter referenced a recent remark made by former President Eisenhower, who said he was unclear about Senator Goldwater's stance on some major issues. President Kennedy was asked if he shared this uncertainty, and if he did, how Senator Goldwater might express himself more effectively.
Senator Goldwater is speaking frequently, and he's saying what he thinks as of the time he speaks, and I think therefore we have an opportunity to make a judgment of where he stands. I don't think Senator Goldwater has ever been deceptive. I think he's made it very clear what he's opposed to, what he's for. I gather I've gotten the idea, and I think that President Eisenhower will as time goes on.
Finally, the president was asked to list the prime selling points of his administration next year, as well as the liabilities.
As we only have a relatively short time, I think that I think we ought to make a judgment on that in '64, and I say that without any lot of these matters, we'll have to decide whether the United States is better off economically than it was before, and whether our position in the world has improved, and whether our prospects for peace are greater, and whether our defenses are stronger, and whether we're making progress at home and abroad. That's a matter which seems to me will be argued very strongly in '64. I think if they pass our tax bill, we're going to be able to demonstrate a very successful bullion economy for a period of 4 years. If they do not, we'll have a different situation. I cannot tell what our relations will be in Southeast Asia a year from now. I know what results our policy is attempting to bring, but I think that result ought to be judged in the summer of '64 and the fall of '64, and I have hopes that the judgment will be that the economy is moving ahead, that we are substantially stronger militarily, that the chances of war have been reduced over Berlin and perhaps in other areas. But I wouldn't want to make those judgments now, because I think we still got a long way to go before next summer. And I think to say that this is the end of the road would be a mistake. I think we ought to be judged by what we do over a 4-year period, and that's the way it's going to be. I'd say we're going to have a hard, close fight in 1964, but that's been my impression for a good many months.
The president and his circle of advisors are said to be generally optimistic about his prospects for re-election next year. This optimism was bolstered by the president's recent successful expeditions into the West and South, where Senator Goldwater's support is said to be strong. Mr. Kennedy has at least 5 more out-of-town trips scheduled before the end of November. 10 days from now, he will visit Boston for a state Democratic dinner. Another political trip will take Mr. Kennedy to Texas on November 21st and 22nd. On Friday, John Connally, the governor of Texas, met with the president in Washington. After the meeting, Governor Connally said he had told the president that he would face a difficult race in Texas next year, but, quote, "I think he'll carry it," unquote. Another trip to Northern California is in prospect for December. I'll have more news for you after this message.
In the time it takes to play chopsticks, Pledge cleaned and waxed this pianista. Better than dusting alone, because Pledge leaves a real wax shine that dries instantly, not sticky or smeary. And the more often you use Pledge, the better your furniture looks. Johnson's Pledge, for wax beauty instantly as you dust.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
In Washington Monday, President Kennedy signed documents ratifying the nuclear test ban treaty negotiated in Moscow this summer. In the White House Treaty Room, the president was flanked by Vice President Johnson, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and other high officials, including Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen. The Republican senator's speech in support of the treaty is widely believed to have diminished any opposition.
If this treaty fails, it will not be our doing. And even if it fails, we shall not regret that we have made this clear and honorable national commitment to the cause of man's survival. For under this treaty, we can and must still keep our vigil in defense of freedom. But this treaty need not fail. This small step toward safety can be followed by others, longer and less limited, if also harder in the taking. With our courage and understanding enlarged by this achievement, let us press onward in quest of man's essential desire for peace.
With the treaty signed and a direct line of communication installed between Washington and Moscow, the administration hopes that further improvements in Soviet-American relations can be achieved. At today's press conference, however, the president dismissed a recent report that the U.S. had agreed in principle with the Soviets to ban nuclear weapons from outer space.
Now, there isn't an agreement. The United States has stated it would not put weapons in outer space. We have no military use for doing so, and we would not do so. The Soviet Union has stated that it does not intend to. There's no way we can verify that, but we're glad to hear the intention. This is a matter, it seems to me, that can be best handled not through any bilateral agreement, but as a General Assembly matter, because other countries may someday have the same capability, and I think every country should declare that they are not going to put atomic weapons in the atmosphere, which could threaten not only the security of a potential adversary, but our own security if for some reason the weapon should miscalculate and descend on us. I think it's a good idea to keep them out of the atmosphere.
On Thursday, Italian Americans in New York City expressed resentment over the national spotlight being given to Mafia informer Joseph Valachi, who has been offering vivid testimony before the U.S. Senate and a national TV audience. Throughout the lower Manhattan neighborhood known as Little Italy, Mr. Valachi was denounced. One Italian-American musician said, quote, "It would be better if Americans were taught that people like Toscanini, Puccini, and Italian scientists were more representative of the Italian people. Most Italians carry violins in their cases," unquote. In an Italian-American neighborhood in Brooklyn, many residents refused to comment, but several charged that the chairman of the hearings, Democratic Senator John McClellan of Arkansas, was seeking personal publicity. Several others contended that the Kennedy administration was seeking political advantage and diversion of attention from other problems. At today's press conference, the president was asked if the Valachi hearings were serving any useful purpose.
I haven't commented on the Senate procedures, and I wouldn't now on this hearing or other hearings. That's a judgment for Senator McClellan and the committee. I do think that we shouldn't get a distorted idea from the hearings. I think that particularly as Columbus Day comes up, I think there may be some feeling of some people that the name Valachi perhaps causes embarrassment to other American citizens. I don't think it should. These difficulties occur in a good many different racial groups, and I think that they ought to feel a good deal of pride in what they've done and not to be concerned because a Valachi or an Irish name or some other name may occasionally get in trouble.
Sports. Right after this.
Americans, stand up and be counted in the fight against communism. You as a private citizen can strike back at communism. Where? In Eastern Europe, where 80 million people still bravely resist communist brainwashing. How? Through Radio Free Europe. RFE's daily broadcasts reach these 80 millions, keeping alive their belief in the free world. Give to Radio Free Europe Fund, Box 1963, Mount Vernon, New York.
The triumphant Los Angeles Dodgers, having made short work of the New York Yankees, are eagerly anticipating record shares of more than $13,000 per player as a reward for their 4-game sweep of the World Series. Some Dodger players will earn additional money from nightclub dates, TV appearances, and endorsements as a result of their stunning victory. The players only share in gate receipts of the first 4 games, so their earnings were not affected by the brevity of the series. But Dodger management would have earned additional shares had the series extended further. On Monday, however, Dodger GM Buzzy Bavasi said, quote, "The prestige of being world champions will be reflected in better attendance at home and on the road next season, plus increased ticket sales. We're all delighted to have taken the Yankees in 4 games. I'd have settled for 3 if possible," unquote. Dodger manager Walter Alston, rumored to be on the hot seat after Los Angeles got off to a slow start in April, will certainly be rehired for 1964. Whether Leo DeRocher remains on his coaching staff is up to Alston. Last year, DeRocher was accused of second-guessing Alston after the Dodgers lost a 3-game playoff with the San Francisco Giants. On Monday, Bavasi said that DeRocher had behaved himself better this season. And finally tonight, Johnny Keane of the St. Louis Cardinals was named the National League's Manager of the Year today in the annual AP poll. Keane, who never played Major League Ball, received 53 of 71 votes cast by baseball writers. Walter Alston was named on 15 ballots, and Bobby Bragan of the Braves on 3. Before the season began, the expert consensus was that the Cardinals would not contend in 1963. But in mid-September, they sat just 1 game behind the Dodgers, having won 19 of 20 games. However, Los Angeles swept a critical series in St. Louis that effectively wrecked Cardinal hopes. Regarding today's award, Keane said, quote, "The only thing that could have made me happier would have been winning the pennant. Somehow, we're going to have to try to match the Dodgers' pitching. But you don't find another Koufax very often. And we're going to have to find somebody to put in Stan Musial's place in left field. But we've got some kids, and they'll get a chance," unquote. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Wednesday, October 9th, 1963. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.